Okay, gang, 6996, video number 3, fall 2014, Doug Darbrow. I kind of like this video. I hope you do. I hope hope you don't think I'm insane after saying that. But guys, what I want to do is get into an examination of quantitative research versus qualitative research. Quantitative research is what you guys are going to do in your master's thesis, preferably. Now, if something comes up where you guys you come up with a problem that's valid, you come up with a master's thesis proposal that's valid, and we determine that it's best examined through qualitative research. We're not going to throw the baby out the bathwater here and just completely forget a very valid component in research, which is called qualitative. We will figure it out. There are some people at Shawnee State University who have performed qualitative research, and we'll do that. But most likely, my role in that would be diminished because I know a little bit about qualitative research. I've actually never been involved in qualitative research, but I've read some research that's qualitative, and we'll just figure it out. So, but most of you will do quantitative research, and guys, quantitative research is deals with numeric data. And really, as I say, research uses objective measurement in a controlled setting to gather numeric data that are used to answer questions or test hypotheses. Guys, qualitative research, first of all, does not begin with a formal hypothesis. And it says it uses different forms of inquiry. I tend to think of the qualitative research as telling a story. Now, quantitative research tells a story also, but it does it quantitatively. P-values, test statistics, confidence intervals. And we kind of infer from that to tell a story about our subject matter, whatever the research topic may be. Qualitative research, I think it's more sentimental, more sensitive, more romantic, if you will, in that it gets involved with human participants, and it just tells a story. I've seen a couple of qualitative research that I actually liked. One of them dealt with, I think I told you guys this before. Qualitative research dealt with the experience of the first African American student in law school at the University of Kentucky. Now, let's think of the pitfalls and the roadblocks if we were going to construct quantitative research. Well, we'd have no variation. We have one subject. Everything that we collect has one measurement. So quantitatively, we'd have no variation, so we couldn't conduct that study. Qualitatively, we can get into through interview process, through storytelling, reading archives, reading different things. We can actually maybe tell a story about the experience of the first African American student at the University of Kentucky. Another qualitative research I saw dealt with what it was like to be a female faculty at the University of Kentucky not that long ago. I think most of this research was done in about the 1980s. And although we have more than one participant in the study, where you could create some quantitative stuff, I think it was more effective to tell a story through the narratives of the people who live this. For example, through some of the through going through some of the archives, people noticed that when female faculty who had earned doctorates were invited to the president's ball, they were addressed as Miss or Mrs. So Miss or Mrs. Krista Maxon, and that would totally piss her off, and you can't blame her. Especially when considering that if a male faculty who had an earned doctorate was invited to the president's ball, they were addressed as doctor. So you can maybe see it from those situations how qualitative research is clearly effective in certain situations. What seems to be the biggie right now is called a mixed methods research. I kind of find this interesting because it seems like everything's about mixed methods today. If you study economy at all, which I'm kind of a nerd about that stuff, we tend to think of the capitalistic economy. A lot of the stuff showing that there's really no such some of the research is showing right now that there's no such thing as a purely capitalist economy. That it's blended in some way, some shape or fashion. So anyway, mixed methods research, as you would expect, combines the two, and ultimately ends up depending on the one that's best suited for the scope of the research. So you kind of go in willing to tell a story, willing to collect data, quantitative measurements, and then you kind of end up combining the two, tell a little story through qualitative, tell your story through quantitative. And so that's kind of the thing that's hot topic today. I've never done a mixed methods. In fact, everything that I've ever done personally or as an advisor of a doctoral dissertation student has been quantitative. So let's take an example and kind of run through this. An education researcher would like to know the impact of a newly instituted dress code in an inner city high school. So what should we do, quantitative or qualitative? A quantitative study, which I would do because that's just what floats my boat. We could measure attendance. We could measure frequency of violations. How many violations of whatever nature. Measure in-school suspensions. We could administer a survey on a scale of 1 to 5, one of those Likert scale things, strongly approved, strongly disapproved, on and on and on. Give those things numbers and do some quantitative stuff that assess the students' attitudes, and we could also assess teachers' attitudes. From a qualitative perspective, we could go in and sit in the back of the room and just observe student behavior, write up some notes, tell a narrative, or present a narrative, tell a story. We could interview people, students, teachers, groups of students, interview parents, and ask a variety of questions. Look for common themes in the responses and tell a story qualitatively. Quantitative research works the following way. There's 6 components. As we said, purpose, study relationships, design, talk about your approach, express the tools, talk about your sample. Quantitative research uses large sample, and our analysis is a statistical analysis. So the purpose, to study relationships, focusing on causes and effects. The design is developed prior to the study. The approach is deductive. The tools are pre-selected instruments, large samples, and statistical stuff. Qualitative. Well, the purpose is to examine a phenomena. You I think you jump into an ocean. I love to scuba dive, so I think about the scuba diving example. You jump into an ocean, you just start looking around, seeing what you can find. The design's very flexible. It evolves throughout the study. The approach is inductive. It may generate theory. The tool, the researcher is the tool because they're the storyteller. Sample, uses small samples. It would be quantitatively, it would be reasonable to collect data on 500 students, for example. It would be quite unrealistic to think that you could go qualitatively and interview 500 students and, first of all, ever finish your study. And the analysis is a narrative and actually tells a story. Guys, our focus is going to be on quantitative research. We're going to look at experimental research. It involves the systematic manipulation of one or more variables. We typically have an experimental treatment, and that's the manipulated variable. And then we have something that we're wanting to observe, and that's our measured variable called the dependent. So in the dual credit flipped learning classroom. The experimental treatment would be flipped classroom versus traditional classroom. We've manipulated that. And what we would end up observing would be some measure of gain in mathematics achievement. Guys, there's 3 types of quantitative research. If you're asleep, wake up. Okay, this is clearly going to apply to you. First of all, there's 2 overarching goals here, and that's the experimental research and non-experimental research. Experimental research manipulates things. For example, in the dual credit, we would manipulate the method by which the instruction is being presented to the student, traditional or flipped learning. Non-experimental doesn't manipulate the variable. It just examines after the fact relationships that may have occurred. Now guys, typically experimental research, at least in my opinion, deals with regression. Non-experimental research, I typically conduct those using ANOVAs, MANOVAs, repeated measures, and things of that nature. Things that you hopefully learned a little bit about in 6600. Guys, experimental research, a university researcher would like to investigate the effect of providing online feedback to students immediately following course examinations. So what are we going to vary? Well, we're going to have 2 sections taught by the same professor. So we'd want to keep that because we want to keep the professor impact out of the equation. Select at random one section to get immediate feedback while the other section receives feedback at the next on-campus session. And then at the end you compare, that's what's been manipulated, would be the method by which the feedback was presented. And then the final measurement, your dependent variable, would be something that takes a look at exam scores, final course grades, or student evaluations. Non-experimental research. Here's the 3 components I was talked about earlier. Ex post facto research, correlational, or survey research. Nothing's manipulated. We just have something that's happened, and we want to look at relationships that may have occurred. Ex post facto research. This is something I've done quite a bit of with placement testing. We looked at some placement test scores, and we've got that information. And at the end of the semester, we look at grades and try to set cutoff scores and see if we can validate our placement tool. So in this one, I say a university researcher would like to investigate the effect of part-time work on achievement in developmental mathematics courses. Well, first of all, we're not going to manipulate that. We're not going to take some students and force them to have a part-time job, and then the other people in our experimental group, our control group, expect them to not work part-time. What we would do is we'd let the chips fall where they may, and at the end of the day, we would examine if there's a difference in some level of achievement. However, we would choose to do that. I would want to look at probably final exam score. I probably would want to look at course grade, and I probably would want to look at some sort of attendance because that might be something that's impacted by part-time work. Correlation research, again, an example I came up with here is the university research would like to investigate the relationship between a student's ACT math subscore and their grade in their initial math class. Again, we're not manipulating anything here. We're just going to have 2 measurements at the end of a class. I can easily get a student's ACT math subscore, and I can easily get their grade in any of their math courses. And I would just want to take a look at the relationship between the 2. So it's a good time to step back and think about what's the difference between ex post facto and correlation. Ex post facto categorized participants into at least 2 groups on one quantitative variable. Correlation has one group of individuals measured on 2 quantitative measurements. So that's a very, very, very important distinction between the 2. Guys, the next thing, survey research. This again would be non-experimental. We're not manipulating anything. For example, a school superintendent may be interested in the way teachers feel. Wow, imagine that. And no, that's not fair. There are a lot of good superintendents out there. To reveal attitudes about a number of reform movements. Again, no manipulation, just after the fact. Here's a well-designed instrument for you to, for the school superintendent to administer to their teachers that could be quantitatively analyzed. Does anybody, let's step back for a second. Survey research, what do you think of the things you learned in 6600? What do you think may be important to implement here? Wow, the silence is deafening, right? What statistical technique did we learn in 6600 that would be appropriate to follow up on attitudes? I would think right off the bat that we'd do some sort of PCA factor analysis. I'd like to see what questions load together, where the commonality is in the responses of survey teachers, and then use those factors maybe in some other statistical analysis. So that'd be something I think that would be interesting there. So questions. In a study designed to determine the effect of varying amounts of sleep deprivation on learning fractions, identify the independent and dependent variable. Remember, independent is what you manipulate, and the dependent is the outcome, what's ultimately measured. Number 2, which research method, experimental, ex post facto, or survey, would most effectively answer the following questions? Do children who eat breakfast get better grades in school? Does a unit on proper nutrition change children's breakfast eating habits? How many children report that they do not have breakfast at home? And do free breakfast programs make a difference in school achievement? All right, guys, the first question, what's the independent and dependent variable? The independent would be the number of hours that they sleep. This would be an ex post facto study, so there wouldn't be a manipulation. We would not, force students, okay, now little Jimmy, you're going to sleep 5 hours tonight, and little Barbara, you're going to sleep 10, we're not going to do that. So we're not manipulating anything. We would just try to get some reliable method of finding out the number of hours that a kid sleeps. And trust me, that would create some problems as well, because do we really know how many hours of sleep we got last night? Answer that's no. Do parents of students, elementary school students, know how many hours of sleep? I can honestly sit here and tell you, my daughters, both 10 years old, I don't know when they went to bed last night. I know they went to their bedroom at 9:30, but I don't stand over them with, we don't video them and see when they go to sleep and get it down. So keep in mind, the number of hours that someone sleeps is a tough one, and I would probably challenge you on any method that you came up with other than just something creepy of determining number of hours of sleep. Number 2, which research method? Guys, in my opinion at least, ex post facto, experimental, survey, and experimental will be the answers there. Guys, that's it. Have a good one. That's all you got this week. Again, don't forget what's going on here. All this stuff is coming full circle to help you do what? To think about education research, to think about the process of scientific inquiry, to help you come up with a topic for your master's thesis proposal. All this is fair game. Maybe you do a survey. Maybe you do some ex post facto stuff where you analyze data that's already been collected. Maybe you design something where you do experimental, where you're going to manipulate some things. If so, you've got to have that in place right now so you can actually carry out the study in the spring semester, so you can collect your data, analyze it, and be ready to present in the summer of 2015. All right, gang, have a good one.